I'm here with American journalist Max Blumenthal, and we're talking about the pro-war narratives being spun by our corporate media. And we're going to talk about Ali Vesci. He's actually Canadian. He works for MSNBC, and he hosts a show on MSNBC. And he's hired. Why do they hire people? They hire people to what? Manufacture consent. They manufacture consent for war. They manufacture consent for their economic war. They manufacture consent for COVID policy. They manufacture consent for any kind of policy, censorship policy, whatever the establishment wants. This guy is their mouthpiece because that's why they hired him. That's why I don't have that job, but he has that job, right? Even though I'll guarantee you more people watch me every month than watch that guy, even with the behemoth MSNBC supporting him. So it's not because he's a good journalist. He's got this job because he's willing to say shit like this.
We are past the point of sanctions and strongly worded condemnations and the seizing of oligarchs' mega yachts. It's no longer sufficient as the evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity continue to grow. Vladimir Putin has no regard for life or humanity or even the rules of war.
Unlike the United States. Now, let's just look what the United States has done just in the last 20 years. Just in the last 20 years. Well, we killed 1 million people in Iraq on a lie. We then did similar in Libya while turning their country into a failed state with open slave markets. Look what we did in Somalia. Look what we're doing in Yemen. Currently in Yemen, we're committing a genocide. Also, does that follow the rules of war, Ali? What are we doing in Syria? We're illegally occupying 1/3 of Syria. Which part of Syria? The oil fields. Barack Obama dropped 26,000 bombs in Syria, also illegal. So this idea that just Russia and Putin are somehow he's a bigger monster than Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and George Bush is just a lie. And that's why he gets a 7-figure salary, because he's willing to tell you those big lies that there's someone else who's a bigger war criminal than the people who run this country. There isn't. There are no bigger war criminals in the world than Barack Obama, George Bush, and Joe Biden.
Proven that time and time again, and he has also pursued the indiscriminate killing of civilians time and time again, twice before in Ukraine and in Chechnya. The global world order and potentially democracy's survival hang in the balance. This isn't the kind of moment that the United Nations and NATO and the UN and the G20 and the Council of Europe and the G7 were made for. What is the point of these alliances if not to stop this? The world cannot sit by as Vladimir Putin continues this reign of terror.
But you're not saying that about Yemen right now. You're not saying that about Syria right now. You're not saying that about Somalia right now. And you didn't say that about Libya when we were doing it. And I'm sure you didn't say it about Iraq. And I'm sure you didn't say it about Afghanistan, which was in 20 years of this. That's what we did. What they're doing in Ukraine, we did 20 years of that in Afghanistan with no plan whatsoever. Didn't even know who our friends or enemies were. We just killed indiscriminately. So I love what Black in the Empire says. I'm not exactly sure where everybody has been living, but our government didn't care about the Kurds, doesn't care about the women in Afghanistan, and doesn't care about the people in Ukraine. They don't even care about the people in America. So this guy, Ali Vesci, is trying to make you think that Joe Biden and the NATO and the United States is there because we care about the people of Ukraine. And that is the biggest propaganda you can spew right now. And of course, Ali Vesci is going to do it because he's hired to manufacture consent and lie to you at the behest of the Western military industrial complex, Wall Street. That's what he's doing. That's what he's doing. What he doesn't know, what Ali Vesci either doesn't know, I know it, I'm a pothead in my basement, what he doesn't know, or pretending he doesn't know, is what Chomsky's going to tell you right now. He said, what is the point? Ali Vesci asked, what is the point of having an organization like NATO if not to intervene now? Well, here's what Chomsky's going to tell you what the point of NATO is and what the point of it's been since 1990.
The question that we ought to be asking ourselves is, why did NATO even exist after 1990? Throughout the whole history of the Cold War, we were told NATO is necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes, okay? No more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? It expands, okay? It expands to the east. Its mission changed. Its official mission now is not to defend Europe from the Russian hordes. It's to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, and to serve as a U.S.-run intervention force.
So that's what NATO's there for. Ali Veshi, the guy with a microphone on MSNBC, doesn't know this. I know it. Pothead comedian knows this. He doesn't.
Well, you know, we're all educated intellectuals. We can now ask a question. What was the nature of the propaganda we were fed all those years? I mean, if NATO was there to defend the West from the Russians, why is it now expanding right to the borders of Russia, becoming a global U.S. intervention force, protecting sea lanes and pipelines and so on? What that tells us is all the talk about the Cold War was just a pure lie. And there's plenty more evidence for that, which we could go into. Educated intellectuals don't pursue this line of thought, but it's a pretty obvious one. Well, going on to Ukraine, Mearsheimer's point is that for any Russian leader, whoever it might be, you know, Mahatma Gandhi, Ukraine is right at the core of their geostrategic concerns. For Ukraine to be taken into NATO, which is what is repeatedly threatened, would be a very serious threat to Russian security, quite apart from historical interests, which go way back, the origins of the Russian Empire, in fact. So yeah, you can give arguments against Russian interference in eastern Ukraine after the coup that took place there, but it's a complicated story, and the West is not without its significant initiatives there.
And here is, I want to play this. I played it in the last segment. I just want you to hear what is exactly going on in Ukraine. This is from 2015. This is the guy that Chomsky just referenced, and watch what he says.
But I actually think that what's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. And I believe that the policy that I'm advocating, which is neutralizing Ukraine and then building it up economically and getting it out of the competition between Russia on one side and NATO on the other side, is the best thing that could happen to the Ukrainians. What we're doing is encouraging the Ukrainians to play tough with the Russians. We're encouraging the Ukrainians to think that they will ultimately become part of the West, because we will ultimately defeat Putin and we will ultimately get our way. Time is on our side. And of course, the Ukrainians are playing along with this. And the Ukrainians are almost completely unwilling to compromise with the Russians and instead want to pursue a hardline policy. As I said to you before, if they do that, the end result is that their country is going to be wrecked. And what we're doing is, in effect, encouraging that outcome. I think it would make much more sense for us to work to create a neutral Ukraine. It would be in our interest to bury this crisis as quickly as possible. It certainly would be in Russia's interest to do so. And most importantly, it would be in Ukraine's interest to put an end to the crisis. Thank you.
And so I guess Ali Veshi doesn't know any of that, this history. He doesn't know actually what's happening. He doesn't know that we helped commit a coup in Ukraine in 2014. He doesn't know that the Ukrainian government wouldn't stop bombing and shelling the Russians in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. He doesn't know any of this. He just wants the United States military and NATO military to intervene in Ukraine right now. So he wants World War III. And I've never seen a guy more openly on TV advocate for a war that I saw Ali Veshi do. Can you imagine? What would you like to say about it?
Well, I remember Brian Williams and
Guided by the Beauty of the Missiles.
I mean, this has become a common thing. But what's interesting is Ali Veshi, this was like his big moment that he had been.
Yeah.
Sort of like a soap opera, and he'd been preparing for his aria. He'd written this script out. This was not spontaneous.
Right.
I mean, this is sort of what he was being asked to do.
Yes.
And he says that we need to fight this war to preserve democracy and the rule of law. And I say, okay, fine. You go first. Because from the looks of you, you can barely run up a staircase without needing a respirator. Like, you can't punch your way out of a wet paper bag. I mean, just look at that guy.
I know.
These are the people that want to fight wars that will never affect them. These soft-handed media hacks. What they want is the boys in Spokane and Scranton to fight the wars for them while they stand back. And he is standing back there. It says he's in Ukraine. He might as well be in Berlin. He could be in the Bahamas because he's in Lviv. I mean, there was one strike on Lviv, but he's not seeing the action. He's not on the front lines. And he's talking about a town called Bucha, which is in the Kiev region, which has been said to be the center of all of these Russian massacres. But we don't know all of the facts, and no network has sought independent verification. In fact, the Pentagon itself, through its spokesman, said there is no independent verification that Russia has carried out massive amounts of execution-style massacres in this city.
Bucha.
So what we could have are combatants who have been killed and buried. We could have some who have been executed, possibly for being Russian collaborators by Ukrainian nationalist forces,
Yes.
or they could have been killed by Russians. We don't quite know. What we do know, however, and we're going to have a piece coming out on this at the Grayzone, is that mayors across Ukraine are disappearing. And while their disappearances are being blamed on Russians, in fact, these are the mayors who advocated diplomacy and the creation of humanitarian corridors with Russian forces, and they're being killed by the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, backed by the Ukrainian SBU intelligence service, which was trained by the CIA and is expert in torture tactics. They're turning up tortured and dead. You have one mayor begging on camera Zelensky to have the Ukrainian intelligence services operating under his watch release his daughter, who has been taken hostage, because this mayor called for negotiating with Russia. And the official who is now leading Western journalists, the Hack Pack, into Bucha to see to these scenes where dead bodies are carted out for them and they can take pictures of them. Some of the dead bodies have camouflage on. Is a guy named Anton Goroshenko. He's the top advisor to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And on his Telegram channel, he celebrated the murder of the mayor of Kreminna, I believe, and said, one less traitor for us to deal with. This dog is dead. So the guy who's leading the Western Hack Pack into Bucha is simultaneously celebrating the murder of Ukrainian mayors who advocate diplomacy.
So people don't realize that there's real Ukrainian Nazis.
This is a monstrous regime from top to bottom, from Zelensky to the bottom. Zelensky went to Bucha, and American journalists don't report this. The American media didn't report this. He said at the end of his comments, if we don't find a civilized way out, you know our people, and they will find an uncivilized way. In other words, we will commit atrocities like the kind that was witnessed and actually confirmed by the New York Times 5 miles away, where Ukrainian and Georgian foreign fighters took down a Russian convoy, and then as the soldiers were captured, they executed them on camera in the field and celebrated over their dead bodies after shooting them and letting them bleed out. One of the commanders of that Georgian unit was welcomed to Congress. We have a piece at the Grayzone on it. He was welcomed by Dianne Feinstein, Kristen Gillibrand, and a who's who of members of the House Foreign Relations Committee, and his name is Mamulashvili. So check out Alex Rubinstein's piece at the Grayzone. I mean, we are supporting, we being the elites in Washington, are opening doors for some of the worst war criminals in the world. They're wagging a finger with one hand at Russia, and with the other hand, they're shaking the hands of full-scale warlords, neo-Nazis, and war criminals. Zelensky brought 2 neo-Nazis from the Azov battalion to the Greek parliament 2 days ago to deliver a videotape message. 2 literal neo-Nazis to a country that was occupied and destroyed by Nazi Germany.
So here's some of the stuff that you'll never hear Ali Beshi talk about. He'll never tell you this is actually a fossil fuel war. He won't tell you that, just like Iraq, just like Libya, just like all of them. Here's what Ali Beshi actually did say on Twitter, which is even more stunning than his video piece. He said, the turning point for the West and NATO will come when the sun rises over Kiev on Sunday. Who the fuck talks like that? And the war crimes against civilian non-combatants becomes visible to all. There is no more time for prevarication. if never again means anything, this is the time to act. We got to go now. We got to go and get into a war on the side of Nazis. That's who there's there he is.
Elshi.
Aaron Mate says to him, hey, how do you propose the West and NATO act? What are you calling for? And he says, direct military involvement. Holy shit. And Aaron says, I don't agree with you, but appreciate your honesty. Not too many people who share your view are willing to actually admit that they want to risk a nuclear holocaust. I would rather see Ukraine accept neutrality and implement the Minsk Accords. Ali Vesey comes back and says, well, I don't disagree. I'm what? I'm not. You do disagree. You just fucking said you disagreed. You want direct military involvement. I'm not sure it's reasonable to expect a country that's been invaded 3 times in recent history by Russia to accept neutrality. It's funny, he does know the history, except he leaves out the parts that doesn't support his narrative or the West or NATO's narrative, which is the part that we overthrew their fucking country in 2014. There was a Minsk agreement. Ukraine is not following it. They are killing Russians in eastern Donbass and eastern Ukraine. That's what precipitated all this. He knows that. He's not telling you that. Why? Because this guy likes to get his 7-figure salary manufacturing consent for murder over fossil fuels. That's who Ali Vesey is. And Ali Vesey is a coward, because if he wasn't, he'd come on this fucking show. But he'll never come on this show because I would embarrass him while I'm high. I would embarrass an MS. You know what Joe Rogan did to Sanjay Gupta? I would do that to Ali Vesey, and I could be stoned out of my head, and I could do that. So there's a guy right there who's pretending not to know what the fuck he's talking about. Here is Victoria Nuland. She was the ambassador from the United States in charge of Ukraine, and the videotape was her picking who's going to be the next president of Ukraine after we overthrew their government. I won't play it, but I'll get back. He says, why should a sovereign country need to accept neutrality as a condition of not being invaded? Aaron says they shouldn't in theory. But in practice, Ukraine is a pawn in a dangerous game. A coup in 2014, a U.S.-backed proxy war, which has killed thousands of ethnic Russians in Donbass, a U.S.-led dismantling of arms control treaties, and NATO being used to attack countries, not defend them. And everybody, so let me just, so I could go on and on and on. I could tell Ali Vesey, here's another thing he doesn't know. Former Defense Secretary Bob Gates in 2015, he said moving so quickly to expand NATO was a mistake. Trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching and especially a monumental provocation. We're doing this. So Ali doesn't know about this. Here's another Pat Buchanan in his 1999 book. Said a republic, not an empire, said by moving NATO onto Russia's front porch, we have scheduled a 21st century confrontation. Ali Vesey doesn't know this. Of course he knows this, but he knows if he tells people this, he'll get fired. He'll have to go do a YouTube show, which no one will watch because he's not interesting. He is a propagandist who is there to manufacture consent. And he's welcome on this show any fucking day. Any day he wants. And here's something else I guess Ali Vesey doesn't know. Here's Noam Chomsky going to school him one more time about what is exactly happening in Ukraine as Ali Vesey spews propaganda to misinform his audience in America.
The idea that Ukraine might join a Western military alliance would be quite unacceptable to any Russian leader. This goes back to 1990. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a question as to what would happen with NATO. Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO. It's a pretty remarkable concession, with a quid pro quo that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used.
So Russia has been provoked.
Well, what happened? NATO instantly moved to East Germany. Then Clinton came along expanded NATO right to the borders of Russia. Now there are the new Ukrainian government, the government after the overthrow of the preceding one, the parliament voted, I think, 300 to 8 or something like that, to move to join NATO.
Which you can understand why they would want to join NATO. You can see why Petro Poroshenko's government would probably see that it's protecting his country.
No, it's not protect. Crimea was taken away after the overthrow of the government, right? And he's not protecting Ukraine, is threatening Ukraine with major war. That's not protection. The point is, this is a serious strategic threat to Russia, which any Russian leader would have to react to. That's well understood.
And here's one more for Ali. For some in NATO, it's better for the Ukrainians to keep fighting and dying than to achieve a peace that comes too early. At least the Post is reporting on this sentiment, which prominent people assured me doesn't exist when I recently criticized it. That's from Ben Friedman. And this is from the Washington Post. And that's a quote from the Washington Post. And the quote is, for some in NATO, it's better for the Ukrainians to keep fighting and dying than to achieve peace that comes too early. So we are using, exactly as it was predicted, the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder for NATO imperialism. You like to say anything to close this out?
Yeah, just why does NATO, why are they so dead set on Ukraine joining? Why did they announce that Ukraine should? There's a document from Stratfor, which is known as the private CIA. It's one of the top private spying and intelligence agencies in the world. They consult for the U.S. intelligence and all sorts of agencies. And they said this after the first successful U.S. color revolution in Ukraine. This is like around 2005. They wrote, without Ukraine, Russia's political, economic, and military survivability are called. To say that Russia is at a turning point is a gross understatement. Without Ukraine, Russia is doomed to a painful slide into geopolitical obsolescence and ultimately, perhaps even non-existent. That is correct. If they have those weapon systems that close to their border and a NATO state controls Russia, what would have been Russia's ports, they face an existential threat like nothing else. And that is why this war is taking place, because this war was brought on by a political project implemented in 2014, which was designed to do what Biden called for in Poland, regime change in Moscow. And everyone needs to understand that. And one person who did was William Burns in 2008. He said NATO membership is a bright red line for Russia. Ukrainian NATO membership is a bright red line for Russia. He's now Biden's CIA director. Why isn't he telling Biden that? Why is he letting this happen? Because the few sane people that might be around Biden aren't fully in charge.
Come see a live stand-up show or be in Orlando, Tampa, Cleveland, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Las Vegas, Omaha, Des Moines, everywhere. Go to JimmyDoreComedy.com for a link for our live show tickets. Also, become a premium member, get access to all our extra stuff, and help support the show. See you at a live show. Single tickets now available. Single tickets available.